Welcome to the World War I podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore a wide range of interesting topics related to World War I. This podcast is sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. Many leaders during World War II were shaped by their service in World War I. Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King was no exception. During World War II, King held the unprecedented dual role of Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, and Chief of Naval Operations. As the Navy's senior operational leader, second only to Admiral William Leahy, President Roosevelt's Chief of Staff, King directed U.S. Navy planning, operations, and administration throughout the war. But what do we know about his World War I service? And how did those early experiences influence his leadership and strategic vision decades later? To help us explore these questions, we are delighted to be joined by Dr. David Kohnen, author of King's Navy, Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King and the Rise of American Sea Power, 1897 to 1947. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Amanda. It's a pleasure to be here.
So why don't you start us off with a brief sketch of King's life and career before World War I?
Sure. Ernie King is the quintessential American character. He is from a working class family in northern Ohio, Lorraine, Ohio. It's a shipyard. It's a railroad head. It's very industrial. It's the rusty shores of Ohio. And he's born right after the Civil War. So the American Civil War is still looming large in the popular zeitgeist when King is growing up. So when you think about the world in which King sort of grew up into the Gilded Age, with Teddy Roosevelt, and then, of course, later on, you have Franklin Roosevelt as well. I like to think of King's early experience as being defined by what I'm calling, in at least the classroom environment, but also in the book, the era of the Roosevelts, an era in which the idea of American sea power matured into an actual plan, which was executed essentially during the first 50 years of the 20th century. And it was people like Ernest King who helped pull all these things together to create what Franklin Roosevelt would call the Navy second to none in the First World War, and of course the two-ocean Navy idea of the Second World War period. And so I would say that King was on a mission, so to speak, from God, like the Blues Brothers, in the sense that there was this image of American sea power that had been born when King was first coming into the Navy, and it was realized by the end of his career when he's wearing 5-star rank. And one nuance that I would say about King's role, at least in the Second World War context, is it's not very well understood, but it's something that King spent a great deal of time explaining to his biographer, Walter Muir Whitehill. King was a 5-star admiral, and of course, that's a rarefied group of people who had 5-star rank in the Second World War context. But before 1944, before he put that rank on, he was the most senior representative for the United States Navy on the Joint Chiefs of Staff and on the Combined Chiefs of Staff. One key sort of nuance is the fact that William D. Leahy had been previously the Chief of Naval Operations, but he retired, and he was an ambassador when Second World War really did start in true form for the United States as a civilian. And Franklin Roosevelt recalled Leahy for service in the Second World War. And of course, Roosevelt had special executive order sort of powers. And Leahy's role was really just a liaison role. He didn't have what we say in the Navy, tasking authority for officers like Ernest King. King was what he called the Commench, the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, and he was the Chief of Naval Operations, the only American officer to hold both functions in the history of the United States Navy. And so up until from 1942 to 1944, Leahy's role was an interesting one in that his primary duty was to be sort of what Roosevelt called the leg man in relations with the Joint Chiefs. But Ernest King was never constrained by Leahy's functions. In fact, King explained that Leahy's role on the Joint Chiefs was as an ex officio member, meaning he can sit at the table and participate in the discussions, but he had no voting authority. And that's an interesting nuance that I think explains a lot of King's behavior in the Second World War context. But again, my argument is you can't understand decisions made in the Second World War without understanding how these people existed within the context of their careers and the experiences from which they were drawing as they were making decisions. And as I mentioned before, King was sort of born in that period of Reconstruction. And so his point of reference throughout the Second World War, from a historical standpoint, are the Napoleonic Wars and the Civil War. And when we think of campaigns, for example, he described the Guadalcanal campaign of 1942 as his Vicksburg campaign, which is interesting, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. I think MacArthur does that sometimes
Yeah.
too. There's a couple of those guys I think who,
Yeah.
remember learning on kind of the knees of that Civil War generation, and they compare a lot of stuff in World War II to the Civil War. But I don't know so much about the First World War and that service. That sometimes seems a little different. How would you describe King's personality, and how did his contemporaries view him, especially in, say, the period prior to World War One? What were they thinking about him?
Well, that's an interesting question. Before World War One, King is your typical Naval Academy product. For that, he's a working class hero, so to speak, in Lorain, Ohio. He drops out of high school to help the family. His mother died of disease. His sister died of disease. His father was working very, very hard, and King, dropped out of high school in order to help, feed the rest of the family. It was a relatively large family, and he worked, and his father was very upset when he dropped out of high school. But he eventually went back to high school, because his father wanted him to graduate from high school. And King graduated as valedictorian of his class. He was very athletic, played football, baseball, and he gave a speech for his valedictory sort of speech at the end of high school, the uses of adversity. So, in other words, King, he lost his mother, he lost his sister, sees adversity as a fundamental element in life. And instead of being beaten down by adversity, King took the view that adversity is what tempers you. Adversity is what enables you to succeed in life in bigger terms. And so the uses of adversity it's an idea that King has early on. Now, his father worked very hard. He pulled the strings, and he talked to the mayor, he talked to the governor, he wrote to the senators, and he got his son into the Naval Academy. Ernie King wanted to go to the military academy at West Point, but he did get into the Naval Academy. And so his father said, that's pretty good. You should go to the Naval Academy and do the best you can. And his father bought him a train ticket to go to the Naval Academy. And King went to the Naval Academy by train. And what's interesting, what I've found out in my research of all this, is that King kept the return ticket that his father had purchased throughout the rest of his career. And it was interesting when I got to hold the return ticket as sort of a good luck charm that he carried with him during his naval career. So I think one of the things that I would say about King is he always knew where he came from, and he worked very, very hard to earn a place at the higher sort of social levels of American society. And the Navy was one of those institutions that did enable that sort of economic and social advancement for working class people like Ernie King. And that all falls together when you think about the policies that are implemented by President Theodore Roosevelt, for example, who specifically targeted Midwestern states for recruiting future officers of the military and naval services. And I do make a distinction between the military and the naval, because in those times, military operations primarily referred to land, and naval operations primarily referred to the blue stuff on the map. And so intellectually, you do have doctrinal and institutional separations that are baked into the constitutional way that the United States is sort of set up from a military standpoint. So when you think about Ernest King as he advances in his career and upwards in rank, the underlying thing that King and his contemporaries are thinking about is how do we work better together, land and sea? And of course, in his time, you're also seeing the advent of wireless communications, airplanes start to fly, and of course, submarines. And early on in his experience, his first dive in a submarine was in 1905. And people like Chester Nimitz were in his orbit as early as 1905. And they were thinking about this technology and how this technology could be used in the future. They had no idea how it really worked. There was no doctrine. And one of the things I point out in the book, a month after the Titanic sank in 1912, Ernest King, as a young officer, a lieutenant, is the officer in charge of an experiment in which a submarine that was commanded by Chester W. Nimitz sends a wireless transmission to a relay ship, the Stringham. King's on board, and then that relay transmission is sent to an aircraft that's flying overhead, which was received by a young ensign named Charles Maddox. And all kinds of interesting people are involved. Bellinger and Towers and all those early aviators are kind of in the mix. And I love finding those sort of historical moments that bring these people together early on. And we all know what happens later with the Second World War. And I'm arguing that in order to understand how these individuals interacted in the Second World War context, which, you know, is the epic time that we all remember, in order to understand how they're actually talking to each other in the Second World War, you do have to understand that they go way back and they all know each other very, very well. And so I think that that's one of the key themes that I like to highlight when I'm talking about officers like King. You can't just begin with World War II and work your way back. You actually have to go the other way. You have to start with the beginning and work your way forward as best you can. And I think by taking that approach, new perspectives can be revealed.
Absolutely. Now, did he know Arthur MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur's older brother? Would they have been working together around this time?
So Ernest King thought very, very highly of Arthur MacArthur. They knew each other quite well in the Atlantic Fleet. They worked together in the Atlantic Fleet. And in fact, Arthur MacArthur had a role in assisting King during the First World War, he was what they called the strategical officer of the Atlantic Fleet staff. He was also chief engineer of the Atlantic Fleet staff. And Arthur MacArthur and Ernest King worked together to plan out and execute the oil refuelings of 1917. They both sort of collaborated in developing that plan. And before 1917, what's interesting is King was part of what I like to refer to as sort of a flying circus of sorts in the destroyer flotilla, which was commanded by William S. Sims. As Captain Sims, he went by Commodore in the destroyer flotilla. And the cast of characters in the destroyer flotilla are very, very interesting as well. So, of course, you have Sims as the Commodore, but you have Dudley Knox as his aide. You have Pete Ellis as a Marine liaison. You have Harold Stark as one of the captains of the destroyers. You have William F. Halsey. You have Taussig. You have Harry Yarnell. You have Ernest King. That's an interesting group of people who are working together as early as 1914 in the destroyer flotilla context. By 1916, these officers they've already developed a procedure, and they executed the first successful underway replenishment in 1916 in the Narragansett Bay. And this is important because you have a refueling ship running at a nominal speed, and you have two destroyers side by side running a beam of the refueling ship, and they're using fire hoses to refuel at the same time in the Narragansett Bay, a full year before the United States joined in the First World War. So when we think about the first refueling operations in combat in 1917, there's an antecedent to that. And, Chester Nimitz in 1964, I think, said, well, I figured it out and I did it all myself and I figured it all out. And the Mommy was the first. Well, that's not true at all. And what's interesting is King is the fleet engineer who's basically hand-holding the Mommy as they are executing those operations in 1917. And I hasten to say that Nimitz was the executive officer of the Mommy. His skipper was Henry Dinger, who is actually an innovator who never gets talked about in any of these stories. And what's important about this type of history is when you read about it in the history books, you tend to see just the date, oh, this happened at this time, and then historians tend to just move on. And what I'm saying is future historians still have a lot of opportunity right now to dive into the archival records and find the backstories that feed into the bigger sort of stories that we all know. And what you'll find out is there's a lot of history we simply do not know. And I think that as we look forward to the world of I think it's historians who truly do have a bigger job to do now in terms of diving into the archival records and bringing context to the history that's being sort of regurgitated to us by AI. I know that was sort of a meandering response to your original question.
We definitely do have a big job to play going forward. And you're right, there are so many stories that have not been brought to light yet. And so, yeah, I would encourage everybody in the field, go find those stories. What do we know about how King viewed the American entrance into World War I feel like I come across a lot of memoirs of Army officers who are either very excited or very irritated, maybe about where they are in their career when the war starts and what they might be sent to go do. But then there's a lot that are very excited, like, oh, good, this is my profession. I've been waiting for a war. I'm very excited about this. It may just be a gap in my own reading, but I don't feel like I tend to understand how naval officers felt about this.
Naval officers of those times, and perhaps a little bit today, understood that they were never unemployed. A war, from King's point of view, is just part of being in the service. And the primary duty for naval officers is to maintain the peace as long as possible. So the mentality that King had was, okay, let's get this job done as quickly as we can. There was no excitement per se about going to war. There was no, I mean, if you're going into combat, for anybody who's done it, you're thinking about where you're going. But for King, there was no excitement. He wasn't looking for the red badge of courage, so to speak. He had seen combat already. He had been in combat in the Spanish American War context when he was a midshipman. He had friends who had been in the Asiatic who had been involved with the Boxer Rebellion, Dudley Knox, for example. He was also close friends, by the way, with Smedley Butler, which is interesting, I think, the Marine. And for King, he had also experienced combat when he was in the Asiatic fleet as a young officer. He not only went ashore during the Philippine insurrection era early on when they were chasing Aguinaldo and everything else. And of course, Douglas MacArthur has an interest in all that as well. But he had also witnessed the return of the Russian ships after the Battle of Tsushima and the damage sustained in combat. He saw those ships. He actually went on board and sort of saw what combat in the battleship period could do to a ship. And he talked about it, and he remembered all of that while he was in the Asiatic. What's interesting is when he was up in Japan, he went to all these different places in Japan as a young officer, and he recalled that his wallet was stolen by a Japanese person. And he talked about how the experience, the impersonal nature of combat based upon, his recollection of losing his wallet, which is kind of humorous, I guess. King is also involved in combat during the Veracruz operations. And of course, Douglas MacArthur is involved with those as well. King's out in the water and he's doing refueling operations, by the way, in 1914, stem to stern type of operations with petroleum during the Veracruz operations, which is interesting. And of course, I talked about the refueling in 1916. So, he's busy, first of all. And when it's decided finally that the United States would go to war against Imperial Germany in the First World War, there was really no big surprises. There was a big lead up to the decision to declare war on Imperial Germany. And there was a lot of stories that go into the decision to go to war with Imperial Germany. And King is part of those conversations. So, I mean, when war is finally declared, there's no sort of excitement or anything like that. It's just, okay, this is the job and we gotta get the job done. That's the context, by the way, which sort of explains how the destroyer operations took place in May of 1917. And as the strategical officer, King went from being a lieutenant commander to a temporary grade commander right away. And Admiral Mayo, the commander-in-chief Atlantic Fleet, Henry T. Mayo, was very good at delegating to his younger officers. So King was about 36, 37 years old when the First World War happened, and he's a commander, which is pretty good. And the first thing that happens is Mayo says, okay, Captain Sims is in London. Sims had donned temporary two-star rank, and then it was made permanent. And Sims was designated as the commander, U.S. Naval Forces in European waters. And there was a big debate over what Sims's role was in London, because under the war plans, Henry T. Mayo was supposed to be the senior most operational commander in the U.S. Navy. And so rather than make a big stink about Sims being in London, Mayo very pragmatically said, well, good, Sims is in London. Now, Ernie, go find out what Sims is up to and report back to me. And so King becomes the liaison officer of the Atlantic Fleet, working with Sims in London. And this was really the birth, from an American doctrinal history, of what we would call joint and combined military operations in the context of modern war. King is witnessing all the challenges and opportunities in working within the context of a coalition during the First World War. So when you think about his World War I experience and then apply that to his approach in the Second World War, I think we can develop a better understanding of why King was behaving the way he was in relations with allies, in relations with the Army, and specifically with the Army Air Forces, which I think is important. The First World War, I would argue, is the definitive moment in the global history of the United States, more so than the Second World War. And the reason I say that is because just 100 years before, you have George Washington and the gang saying they don't want to pay taxes. King George III and the Revolution and all of that sort of discussion. Then you have the Civil War. And now you're operating within the context of a French, British, Russian, Japanese, Italian, Belgian coalition. You got to figure out how to work with these other allies. They're all different. They all have different objectives. And as far as the United States was concerned, our objectives were not very well defined in the First World War, which may sound slightly familiar, but, all wars are like that, which is interesting. And so it's people like King at a younger level who are really figuring it out. They're helping the admirals and the generals to tie all this together at the staff level. And I would argue that experience in the First World War, 1917, 1919 timeframe for King, and I did not say 1918, right? 1919, the war is really still going on. And the staff discussions are still going on, which I'll get into if you like. But that's a formative period. And he developed some close friendships with several people, which later on turned out to be very important in the Second World War context. Dudley Pound, for example. Captain Dudley Pound and Ernest King worked very closely together in the operations divisions of the Admiralty, trying to coordinate British, American, French naval operations in European waters. So Pound and King are working together doing that. Roger Keyes and Ernest King are very close friends throughout the 1920s and 30s. Andrew Cunningham. And of course, these guys are all interacting with John Jellicoe and Admiral Sims. These guys are all influencing each other. And the elder officers are certainly making an impression on the younger officers who would later become the elder officers And, the younger officers like King are taking notes, and, they're seeing what works and what doesn't work. And later on, I think that experience helps them to figure out ways to win in definitive terms in the global context of the Second World War.
So he spends most of the war in Europe with Sims, working a lot with the coalition partners. How would you describe his relationship with the British in particular?
It's very cordial. In fact, Ernest King sort of told a story that he was related to a British admiral named King who served with Nelson, and he reveled in all of the British naval traditions and celebrated. And by the way, he was not at all related to this British admiral. But King, it was in those times, naval officers in particular would tend to embellish their familial connections. Admiral Sims, for example, commissioned a family tree that traced him back to the Mayflower, which is complete. It's not true. So there was this sort of culture that officers like King was, they were working in. What I would say about his experience with the British is he learned a lot from them. He understood that the British Empire had evolved over 300-year period or so, and it worked quite well. But the problem with empire is the problem with empire. And the way the British operated was, as King put it, they were tied to the pier. In other words, the British had evolved their navy alongside their empire. And so the navy was always pulling into ports. The ships would be refitted. The sailors would go ashore and get tattoos, get drunk, and maybe jump ship altogether. The ships were stuck at the pier side from King's point of view. And of course, when you have naval bases around the world, you have to have army garrisons to defend those naval bases around the world. And of course, with every army garrison, once you have airplanes, you have to have an airport parked next to the army base that's connecting to the naval base. And so you have to defend all that. And that's part of the problem with the British way from King's point of view. King was a naval officer. He wanted to get to a place where the Navy never really pulled into port, that they were always going to be operational at sea, the Navy at least. And he wanted to get to a place where we were not going to be the British Empire, where we have this vast global garrison that we're maintaining. King had a completely naval point of view. And I talk about in the book, for example, Lieutenant Robert Heinlein served under King on board the USS Lexington in the 1920s, 1930s. And Robert Heinlein would later go on to become this great science fiction writer. And conversations he had with Ernest King about the fundamental nature of sea power are the sort of foundation for a lot of the science fiction stories that Heinlein was writing about during the 50s and into the 60s, which is what I'm working on now, by the way, in my own sort of spin-off of King. But when you think about King's mentality about sea power, he's thinking about the global context. He's not just focused on the green stuff on the map. He's looking at the blue stuff, and he's even looking beyond to the stars. And King is reading all of this stuff that's being written by people like Alfred Thayer Mahan and Julian Corbett. The things that he was reading was always sort of forward oriented, but King was always anchored to his understanding of history. Does that make sense?
Yes.
He's always looking outward, to use Mahan's phrase, but he's looking to the past. He's looking to history to ground himself as he's looking outward. One of the great discoveries, for me at least, was King's own family connections. He's got cousins who are serving in the Royal Navy. His wife is very well connected to the old upper class of Old England. His wife comes from a very good family. King married well. To say that King is an Anglophobe, which is something that we see in the historiography, is really a simplification that is absolutely not correct. If anything, King is an Anglophile. But as Francis Lowe, one of his closest associates, observed, King had a job to do during the World Wars, and his job was to be pro-American. And that's the job that King did during the World Wars. King was pro-American. He knew who was signing his fitness report, as we say in the Navy. And so I would caution historians who use the shortcut to say he was an Anglophobe. He's not. He's not an Anglophobe. He is an Anglophile, but he knows who he's working for. And he's working for the Constitution of the United States.
Right. So I think you've already kind of answered this, but if you had to draw a line from his World War I experiences to his vision of how the US Navy should operate in the future, how personnel should be trained, what the doctrine, what the philosophy of the US Navy should be, could you draw that line for us one more time? That
Sure.
impact from World War One to his big vision for the future.
Sure. Well, again, with World War One, I look at World War One as sort of a milestone in a much longer chronology. His experience with submarines predates World War One. Wireless communications, of course, is in its infancy at the beginning, but by the end of his experience, King is using wireless to sink U-boats globally through Combat Intelligence Division. He's also an innovator as it pertains to aviation. So King's doing it. He's on the cutting edge of technology, all the while studying, history to sort of ground himself on the cutting edge. He did the wireless test with Nimitz in 1912 involving the aircraft, and that everybody claims that is the first documented time when a submarine communicates with an airplane in 1912. So, I mean, when you think of World War One and you tie that together with the Second World War experience, what I'm arguing is it's not the war necessarily. It's the longer experience that informs the discussion. The practical application of military force in the First World War also provides lessons that may be applied in developing doctrine in peacetime. That's how King sort of approaches these things. If anything, to keep the answer as tight as I can, what you have in 1919 with Sims and King and Knox, and of course his good friend William Pye. Sims comes home with a chip on his shoulder. He's very upset with the way things went in the First World War. He was very angry with Josephus Daniels, and he didn't think that Woodrow Wilson did a very good job either as president of the United States. And so Admiral Sims came home with a chip on his shoulder, and his followers, his younger proteges, also came home with chips on their shoulders about how things went in the First World War. None of them were satisfied with the way things went in the First World War context. I tell the story in my book, King's Navy. When King came home, he opened a package that had come in the mail, and it was the Navy Cross. And King said to his wife, Maddie, he said, the Navy Cross is neither worthy of the Navy nor the cross. That's how cynical he was. King was thinking about even getting out of the Navy. He had almost 20 years in service, and he had opportunities to go become a millionaire if he wanted to as a sugar guy. He also had a job offer to go work in oil. So, I mean, King could have left the Navy after First World War, but he didn't in the end. He committed himself to the profession. And, what's interesting, of course, he's also the father of a growing family. He had multiple commands of warships by the time he had been in the First World War. He was a temporary rank of captain at age 38. They called him the boy captain in the Navy, at least. But by 1923, he's got 7 kids. He had been the chief of staff of the Atlantic Fleet. He had done a lot by the time he's age 40. It's a complicated world. He's cynical. And he sits down at a typewriter after he has a lot of conversations with Captain Dudley Knox and his friend Commander William S. Pye. And together they hash out something called the Knox Pye King Report. And it's a bunch of, rants about the fact that education for service practitioners was so inadequate, that they were not ready intellectually for the challenges of the First World War. And the KPK report, as it was known in the time, was really an indictment of senior officers and policymakers. And one of the phrases that comes to mind from the KPK report of 1919 was that the highest ranking admirals of the United States Navy were, quote, they were only educated to the lowest commissioned grade. which is basically implying that our highest ranking admirals are really just educated to be ensigns from a educational standpoint. Technically, they know how to run a steam plant, but they can't read a book. That's a big indictment, I think, for junior officers to be saying that in formal form. Now, the KPK report was circulated around the Navy Department, and it found its way to the circular file, but it somehow got published in the Naval Institute proceedings after it had been suppressed by the Navy Department. And what's interesting about the fact that it was published in the Naval Institute proceedings without any attribution to the authors, what's interesting is that the editor of the Naval Institute proceedings at the time was none other than Ernest J. King. So that's how that got published.
Yeah.
King goes on in the Navy, and he's on that cutting edge of technology. He literally volunteers to go to the submarine flotilla because it was an opportunity for him to maintain his rank as a captain. He does revert in rank to commander, but he volunteers to go to submarines, and that enables him to get into a billet that enables him to go back to the rank of captain. He then experiments with group tactics. Now, this is something that the Germans were playing around with in the First World War, using submarines in groups. But for King, this was not new at all. They had been doing torpedo group attacks under Shims in the destroyer flotilla. So they were using destroyers in groups to do torpedo attacks. I mean, the Germans applied the same tactic with submarines in 1918. And so King, during the first fleet problem after the First World War, as the submarine, flotilla commodore, he experiments with submarine group tactics. So one of the problems in our historiography of the Second World War is that the Germans came up with Wolfpack tactics. No, that's not true at all. It's much older. And Karl Dönitz, of course, is applying it at a big scale in the Second World War context. But the tactic itself is not at all a German invention. If anything, it's coming out of the torpedo boat doctrine of the pre-First World War period. It's just being used in submarines. Now, when you do continue the sort of evolution intellectually of King in the 1920s and 30s, King qualifies as an aviator at age 49, and he commanded the USS Lexington. As a captain, he has, people like Lieutenant Heinlein running around as an aide, and King is technically Heinlein's first editor. So if you're into science fiction, Robert Heinlein's first editor was Ernest King. And also the inspiration for a lot of the fictional characters that Heinlein conjures up in his stories from the 1950s. So your science fiction, and what's interesting about that is, of course, Gene Roddenberry read Robert Heinlein and created the Christopher Pike character of Star Trek fame. So, you could argue that Ernest King is Captain Kirk's long-lost grandfather or something.
Really?
No, I'm just...
No, is King was possibly gave them the idea for Captain Pike?
So Ernest King is an inspiration for the Captain Yancey and Captain Doyle characters in the Robert Heinlein fictions. Gene Roddenberry based his initial sort of script on Heinlein's book Rocket Ship Galileo. And so the characters in Rocket Ship Galileo are characters that Roddenberry is drawing from in his sort of treatment in Star Trek, which is an interesting sort of connection. And I'm working up a follow-on that examines that.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's wild.
It is. I mean, I love the literary sort of connection to this history. And as we think about how this history unfolds in King's, sort of military service experience, it is interesting to think about how the science fiction genre can add a little bit of flavor to the history as we think about it.
I always think it's so interesting how pretty much most, I think, of our great leaders in World War II, they get so much experience from World War I, and then they just scale it to an incredible level. And I think King is like a really great example of that. Now, before we let you go, I do want to ask one more question, and that is, When I saw you last, you told me a story of King having met Douglas MacArthur during the First World War. And I did not know about that. And MacArthur, in typical MacArthur fashion, I guess, does not mention this meeting in his autobiography. Do you want to tell us about that story?
Yeah, so King, of course, is friends with Arthur. He knows Douglas MacArthur. He's known Douglas MacArthur since the destroyer flotilla. Actually, it was Admiral Sims who introduced the two. Sims and MacArthur knew each other from when they worked at the White House with Teddy Roosevelt. But King's brother-in-law, this isn't the interesting piece. King's brother-in-law was an Army officer named Walter D. Smith, who was a big football player at the Naval, not the Naval Academy, but at West Point, the military academy at West Point. His brother-in-law, Walter D. Smith, is very close friends with Douglas MacArthur. And so when King was in France in 1918 as Henry T. Mayo's liaison to the Atlantic Fleet, King took the opportunity to go up to the front to go see Walter D. Smith. And Walter D. Smith introduced him not only to Douglas MacArthur, but also Wild Bill Donovan, who would later go on to create the OSS. So King, met these guys at the front, and they actually had a glass of wine together, and King talked about this with his biographer, Walter Muir Whitehill. And what's interesting about King's perspective on MacArthur, I didn't jot it down, I should have, but King said that MacArthur had this way about him. You could see that MacArthur had the discipline, he had fostered this image of MacArthur that only MacArthur had in his own mind. He had this, what a soldier should look like, and MacArthur made himself that soldier. And King said something like, MacArthur would speak in Shakespearean soliloquy. Give MacArthur a job, and he'll explain to you how he'll do it in the most flowery way. Give Eisenhower a job, and he'll say aye, aye, and just get it done. That's how King kind of described it, which is funny. I think their relationship was an interesting one. If you read what they call the Nimitz Gray Book, it's really not Nimitz's Gray Book. It's just message traffic, and it's an interesting document. But if you read the communications between Comminch and MacArthur, there are some sort of back channel jokes built in to some of the messages between King and MacArthur, that they know each other quite well. King respects MacArthur. He does not really respect Marshall in the same way. He does respect MacArthur. He's a little bit afraid of MacArthur. He thinks MacArthur has a screw loose at some level, but he also thinks that MacArthur is a military genius. These characters are endlessly fascinating, and I look forward to future historians continuing the conversation we're having now.
And as you said, context is so important. And World War I is just one piece of the puzzle for many of these leaders, but you really can't understand the bigger picture, I think, without knowing what they did and what they experienced in that First World War. So, Dr. Kohnen, we just thank you so much for taking the time to chat today, and we look forward to your future projects.
Well, thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.